Sorry to be late. Last week I said that the Affordable Care Act is no longer affordable to increasing numbers of people. I regret that my statement was wrongly used against Democratic candidates in Minnesota and elsewhere. Yesterday, President Obama said, quote, "Just because a lot of the Republican criticism has been proven to be false and politically motivated, doesn't mean there aren't some legitimate concerns about how the law is working now." I agree. For the 95% of Minnesotans who are covered through the Medicaid expansion, Minnesota Care, or their employer, the law is working. It's working for the 3% who qualify for the federal tax credits through MNsure. But the law isn't working well for the 2% of Minnesotans in the individual market who don't receive any financial assistance to pay for their coverage. In this emergency for some Minnesotans and their families, I'm hopeful that DFL and Republican legislators will be able to set aside the politics of the Affordable Care Act, work together, and find a short-term solution for those in crisis. During the past couple of weeks, some legislative leaders have said that a special session is critical. It is now time to walk the talk and agree upon a solution to provide much-needed relief. I urge the four caucus leaders to decide quickly how they want their members to work with our administration to devise a plan of action for those Minnesotans who are not eligible for federal tax credits. That plan should be agreed upon before November 1st, so that the Minnesotans needing our help can know what it will be before the open enrollment period begins. After the four caucuses have agreed upon a plan, and their four leaders, the Lieutenant Governor and I, have agreed to the parameters of a special session, I will call it. I propose that the approximately $313 million, which is scheduled to be added to the existing $1.9 billion reserve fund on December 2nd, be instead used to provide financial assistance to those Minnesotans whose premium increases would cost an excessive percentage of their incomes. The reserve is intended for rainy days. Right now it is pouring on some Minnesotans. Fortunately, our previous budget surplus and sound fiscal management have built up this healthy $1.9 billion reserve, thus enabling us to use the additional money for this present emergency. There are 120,000 Minnesotans who purchase on the individual market and whose incomes exceed the federal eligibility levels, which is 400% of the poverty level, or $47,000 for an individual and $97,000 for a family of four. These are the Minnesotans who urgently need our help. Minnesotans who receive their health insurance through their employers, Medicare, Medicaid, or Minnesota Care, need not worry about the large rate increases which have been receiving so much recent publicity. They will affect only people who buy their insurance in the so-called individual market. And those Minnesotans who buy their individual policies through MNsure and qualify for the federal tax credits will be largely protected from those increases. The Minnesota Department of Health estimates that there are as many as 100,000 Minnesotans who are eligible for state health care programs and federal tax credits, but are currently not taking advantage of them. So I strongly urge Minnesotans to contact MNsure representatives and find out how much those tax credits could reduce or even eliminate their premium hikes. I'm also asking the health insurers to send letters to all their members, encouraging them to shop through MNsure. Time is running short, so legislators must begin their work immediately and reach agreement quickly. I'll be glad to answer questions on this subject.
Governor, you say here that you regret that this statement was wrongly used. Do you say that you regret the statement or that it's untrue? Can you kind of elaborate on your feelings?
I don't believe the statement's untrue. I believe the statement is true, and I stand by the statement. I regret that it was that one snippet that, what did I say here? The Affordable Care Act, quote, is no longer affordable to increasing numbers of people, close quote. I stand by that statement. Those are the people we want to help in this reaching an agreement in a special session. It's been used to say that the whole program, whole Affordable Care Act is a disaster, and that it's all Democrats' fault or DFLers' fault here. It's blamed on MNsure, which is totally inaccurate. The Republicans in the Congress have totally refused to make any of the improvements that would have reduced these premium increases. And they voted how many? Over 50 times to abolish MNsure, which is without offering any viable alternative. So that's what I was referring to.
Governor, if this plan is agreed upon before November 1st, would you call the special session before the election?
I mean, that's a discussion I'd have to have with the leaders. I don't know that that's practical. The Capitol's closed. They're going to have to work out the logistics. They're going to have to give notice. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think the special session, if there is one, needs to be before November 1st or before November 8th. So I probably, given the fact that legislators understandably have full scale schedules for up to election days, my guess is it'd be better to have it after the election, as soon as possible after the election. But again, I'm not going to. I'd have to talk to the four leaders. The first thing is for the four caucuses to agree on a solution working with my administration, and let's get through that part first.
Governor, over the past year or so, there's been a lot of calls for special sessions, to help resorts, Lake Mille Lacs with the walleye shortage there, and now we have a problem here with folks facing sky-high premiums. Given the no special sessions on those other issues, I mean, what do you say to people who at this point might be feeling fatigued at all these special session calls but none materializing?
Well, I share their fatigue. It's been an arduous process. Took the whole summer, 4 months, to try to come to an agreement to have a special session, and all the politics surrounding that just made it impossible. So here we are, less than 3 weeks from the election, and in that white hot political atmosphere, it's going to be a big stretch for legislators to set aside their politics and focus on what we can do to relieve this burden on Minnesotans. I hope the urgency of the situation, that the number of people that they've heard from, as I have, from people who are severely affected or will be severely affected by this next year, will be sufficient to enable them to set aside the politics and focus on policy. I note that both Speaker Dowd and now Senate Majority Leader Bach have called for a special session, so it's been a bipartisan appeal, and I hope they'll set the politics aside and reach an agreement.
Governor, just last week you said that you wouldn't speak to any of the caucus leaders until, and particularly Republicans, you said, until after Election Day. What's changed?
Well, again, I've heard from Minnesotans who are being severely affected by these increases, people who don't qualify for the federal tax credits, buying in the individual market. And given that now both leaders of both parties have called for a special session, again, it gives me a glimmer of hope that they can set their politics aside and focus on what they need to do to reach an agreement. And my administration, Commissioner France, Commissioner Bowerly, and others are ready and willing to work with them as soon as they're ready to proceed. They have to decide how they're going to proceed, but we're ready to move quickly with them.
Governor, how do you respond to criticism that you wouldn't have called for this type of aid or short-term fix unless there was an election looming, that this is just a political ploy?
Well, everything at this stage in an election is considered to be a political ploy, or can be accused of being one. I mean, the urgency is very real out there. It has nothing to do with the election. It has to do with the fact that these rate increases are going to take effect on people who don't have any other means of assistance, and so the same imperative would exist whether or not there were an election.
In your Star Tribune op-ed, you asked readers to consider sending you an all-Democrat legislature. Are you concerned that the political fallout from these premium increases is going to fall mostly on Democrats?
You know, we'll see. I mean, there's certainly been attempts, blatant attempts by Republicans in Congress and in Minnesota and by the special interest PACs supporting them to blame these increases on Democrats in Washington, Democrats in Minnesota, which is just absolutely untrue. I mean, there are basic changes that could be made, improvements to the Affordable Care Act in Washington that could reduce premium increases for everybody, people getting insurance through their employers. If you have a reinsurance at the federal level where you have claims above a certain amount, catastrophic claims that are covered by the federal government by a common pool, I mean, then every individual insurer would not have to protect itself against those catastrophic claims, and you'd see the rates lowered for everybody. I mean, and that should be a common sense, just basic solution that Republicans and Democrats can support. And the fact that it can't even be debated in the House, and the broadening the eligibility for the tax credits, increasing the tax credits, something else that should be considered. So there's some basic, fundamental remedies that could have prevented these kinds of increases. And again, I stand by my statement that the Republicans in Washington prohibited that the discussion and those considerations. There are other issues as well, but those are the first two that come to my mind.
How would this $313 million be used, and what would it bring individual premiums down to?
Well, that's what we have to work out, and we'll work with the legislative designees for this. You can do the math. I mean, there are 120,000 people affected, and 313 million. I think we figured it was like $2,600 per person, but not everybody, will need that amount. I mean, the goal would be the goal of the Affordable Care Act is to bring people's premiums down to less than 10% of their incomes, and so that would be a kind of a guideline for the proceeding here. But whether it's a rebate, tax credit, whatever it is, has to work, has to be implementable, which is what Commissioner Bowerly and Commissioner Franz need rightfully to be concerned about. It's got to be able to be implemented. But so that's why we don't have all the answers. We're not. I'm not going to wait till we have all the answers. I want the legislators to provide their answers.
Governor Dayton, in the time since you made the comments about the Affordable Care Act no longer being affordable, have you been in contact with the president or his administration? And if so, what was the?
I talked with the government affairs liaison, Jerry Abramson, shortly after my comment, clarified the context of it and clarified the fact that it wasn't reported completely. And then he asked if I'd like to talk with Secretary Bowerly. Burwell, sorry, Commissioner Bowerly, Secretary Burwell of HHS. And I traded voicemails with her 3 different times. Now she's traveling. I believe she's traveling, so she put me in touch with administrator of CMS, Andrew Slavitt, and I had a lengthy conversation with him yesterday, and he sent me some further information about the situation, and so those are the only conversations I've had with administration officials.
Are you saying the White House called you because they were concerned about your comments?
No, I called him. No, as I was taking it back, Jerry Abramson called me the next day, and he wanted to just get a clarification. I know what the president said yesterday. He said just because a lot of the Republican criticism has been proven to be false and politically motivated doesn't mean there aren't some legitimate concerns about how the law is working now. So the president's acknowledged that there are these problems.
Do you regret signing the MNsure and changing the system so drastically?
No, I mean the Affordable Care Act was a federal law. It was going to be applied to Minnesota whether we establish a state exchange or not. Some people said we should have just joined the federal exchange. They've had their problems at a much larger scale given the numbers of people and in terms of the computer functionality and alike, and some of the things we were able to do at the state level to improve upon the law. We couldn't have done if we were just part of a federal exchange. So, Minsugar gets wrongly blamed for everything that is really a function of the issues with the Affordable Care Act. I mean, it's had its own difficulties as well, but the reality is that these increases are due to the repercussions from the Affordable Care Act and the intransigence, the unwillingness of Republicans in Congress to make the necessary improvements. They want Minsugar to fail. They want the Affordable Care Act to fail. They want them to fail. And they're going to do everything they can. They've already made it clear they'll do everything they can in the next Congress to continue to try to force it into collapse. Even though they don't offer anything else, implicitly what they seem to offer is just go back to the old days where every insurance company made its own pitch, and every consumer had to try to figure out what was covered and what wasn't covered, and then found out after it was too late that what they believed was covered was not. And then over half the federal personal bankruptcies in this country before the Affordable Care Act were because of unaffordable health costs. What the Affordable Care Act has done in terms of reducing the uninsured in Minnesota and in the country to historic lows, to protect everybody from being denied coverage for pre-existing conditions, to eliminate the lifelong caps on the use of health care insurance for those who need it, coverage of dependents up to the age of 26. I mean, there are a whole number of really extraordinary improvements made by the Affordable Care Act, which can't be lost, shouldn't be lost in this debate. And so I agree with what Secretary Clinton has said. I'm paraphrasing her here now. I'm not quoting directly, but we should improve the Affordable Care Act, but not demolish it.
Governor, of the emerging proposals now by House Republicans in the Senate DFL, any of those, any parts of those proposals that would be a non-starter for you?
Nothing's a non-starter. I mean, we'll look at it, and we've done some cost estimates. Senator Abler and Representative Hamilton proposed a reinsurance siting in Alaska, but theirs is a much smaller population, and our Department of Commerce estimates to buy down the rates. The rate increases for next year would cost $290 million, and to buy them down entirely would cost $580 million. Furthermore, it's too late now to do that, to have that effect on 2017. We looked at rebates. That's one thing where I think we, at this point, think is probably the most promising. But tax credit. I mean, and again, we're still working on it, and we'll continue to work with the legislators on it as well.
Anything else on this topic?
Can you or Commissioner Franz kind of explain the mechanism of that $13 million going to the budget reserve and how that can be pulled back and repurposed?
Well, it could either be repurposed by legislative action before December 2nd, before the forecast, at which point it automatically transfers to the reserve fund. But the reserve fund is a designation. It's money in the general account of the state. So I mean, the legislature could come back after December 2nd and pull that money back out. But it would require legislative action. But it's not it's not locked up and put away. It would be the prerogative of the legislature, and with my concurrence, to either take it now or take it afterwards. You want to elaborate? Is that do it more or less? That's the late version.
I mean, it sounds like you think it's an appropriate use for the rainy day fund for this. I mean, under the state law, I mean, the third of the budget surplus has to go to the rainy day fund. I mean, what bar will this set for future instances where some of the surplus money might be spent on situations like this?
Well, again, it's a rainy day fund, and right now it's not just raining; it's pouring on some Minnesotans, and that's I believe what the fund was used for. We fortunately have an unprecedentedly high reserve, $1.9 billion, which is because we raised taxes on the wealthiest 2% and turned chronic budget deficits into surpluses, and because we've had sound fiscal management, been recognized by Wall Street, rating agencies, and others. And so we've built up this unprecedented reserve, $1.9 billion. Now, we have little bit more to go, a little bit relatively speaking, to reach the statutory ceiling on that. And we'll go back to that again in the future with continued economic growth. But for right now, those funds, I believe, can and should be used to deal with this present emergency.
Governor, have you thrown this idea off the legislative leaders to get their
I've talked with, I've not talked directly with Representative Thiessen. I've talked with Senator Bach just briefly last night, told him it's forthcoming. We're still working on the particulars, so I didn't have anything to share with them, but they're both aware that I'm going to calling this press conference, going to call for a special session if they can reach agreement. Can we do other subjects?
Governor, the topic today is the short-term fix, and I'm really glad to see some attention given on that. But what assurance can you give us that, for upcoming years, that the state will look at longer-term fixes? Because I think it's questionable at best to wait for the feds to take action. I think the state has to look at options as well.
Well, we'll look at options, but again, they'll be expensive. We already know that. I mean, the magnitude of the, as I say, the reinsurance, sounds on the face of it, and it costs Alaska $55 million, but it would cost us, Department of Commerce, to do what Alaska did. It cost us $580 million. It costs $290 million to buy them down by half. So, and we start pouring state money into, subsidizing the insurance policies. I mean, we can't afford to do that on a sustained basis. Or if we can, it'll use up the entire surplus. We'll wait and see what the next forecast shows in December 2nd. But at best, it would cover, take up just about everything. So, we're not. There are all sorts of proposals that have already been advanced, and they'll all be considered by the next legislature as they should be, and we'll see, which ones we'll have a chance to look into all of them in more depth than they have so far. And see what we can come up with. But yeah, we can't wait for the federal government, although we can't afford to solve the federal government's problems for them.
Anything on other topics?
Nothing else? Lynx had a terrible loss last night. I agree with Coach Reeves, who's just a phenomenal coach. I watched her tape of her press, and I agree with her assessment of what a tragedy is when bad officiating, in that critical moment, might change the outcome. I invited the Lynx to come tomorrow we were going to have the reception at the governor's residence for them. They won, but I decided to make an exception and have it anyway. I don't know that we've heard back, and they probably aren't they're probably not in the mood to come and go through that, but they're a phenomenal team, and they've made all Minnesotans proud. And it was an epic game last night by two really great teams, and came up just a fraction short. Anything else? Okay, thank you.